Amidst the intense fighting with the Taliban, the Indian embassy in Kabul today put out a very important security advisory for Indian nationals in Afghanistan, asking them to leave Afghanistan before commercial flights cease to operate, and that is imminent. There may be flights to Kabul for the moment, but other cities, that's going to be a problem. Indian companies have been asked to withdraw their employees from Afghanistan and facilitate immediate travel back to India. Well, joining us now, Dawood Mohammadi, the Deputy Director of the Tarzi Research Foundation at Kabul. We're also joined by Ambassador Vivek Karju, who is an expert on this region, spent a career looking at Pakistan and Afghanistan. I'm just going to go through a couple of the important points that have been mentioned over here. Now, what the embassy has said is, as violence in many parts of Afghanistan has escalated, commercial air travel services to many provinces and cities are getting discontinued. All Indian nationals visiting, staying and working in Afghanistan strongly advised to keep themselves updated and make immediate travel arrangements to return to India. There is an evacuation which is taking place of Indian diplomats, consular staff and Indian nationals from the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif this evening, tonight itself, and that is an indicator of the imminent collapse of Afghanistan. So, Mr. Mohammadi, in a situation like this, I mean, do you believe that it's now just a question of weeks before you're left with Kabul, and it's a complete collapse of the country around Kabul?
Thank you so much. No, this is not the question of the collapse of the state or the government. But I think the government of India take this step as a precaution measure. So this is very normal thing. Countries taking such steps during the crisis or violence will escalate. I think India has very good experience in the Libya case, in the Syria case, in the Iraq case is the main example of that scenario. But as for now, I think this is the responsibility of every government to protect the security of their citizens inside the country and also abroad. So I think it was for the security reason, not the fear that the government will be collapsed.
Okay, let me put that question to Ambassador Karju and Suhasini Swami also with us at the stage. Ambassador Karju, is it your belief now that it's just a matter of time? Unfortunately, sooner than later, that we're going to be back in a situation which existed pre-96, say 94 to 96, and where essentially Kabul held out, and a complete collapse.
Well, if I recollect correctly, the Taliban advance took a couple of years. They first got through to Kandahar, and then the next year they moved into Shindan, then Herat, and thereafter into Kabul, and it was a year after that, in 97, that they went into Mazar and they had to retreat, and in 98 they finally captured Mazar and got a whole lot of the north. So that took a number of years. This move is far more, is far quicker.
Yes.
And over the last few months, it's been astonishing in its quickness, and the 6 provincial capitals that have fallen. Let us note that one of them is in the southwest, the other is in the northwest, 2 of them are in the north, and 2 in the central part of the country. So the range of the Taliban operations is also very, very extensive. Hence, the Taliban seem to be having momentum. They were in the rural areas initially. Now they've moved into provincial capitals. They are clearly exercising great pressure on Mazar, on Mazar-e-Sharif, on Herat, and on Kandahar.
Yep.
So therefore, the situation is extremely serious, and I'm happy to hear from our Afghan friend that he is full of confidence. But I do not know whether the international community shares that confidence.
Yeah.
The Americans are there. They are helping with some air operations. After October 31st, there are serious questions whether those air operations will continue.
Right.
And quite clearly, and this is my last point, Vishnu, that clearly the only effective fighters that the Afghan government has are their special forces. And the question is, where will they deploy them?
All right.
So,
No, exactly.
It's fairly thin on the ground.
They are very
and
thin on the ground at this stage.
The situation is turning precarious.
Suhasini, where do talks with the Taliban presently lie? Given the territorial gains they are making, is the Taliban serious about talks at all?
Well, so far, everything we have seen, Vishnu, has shown that the Taliban talks in Doha, but the actions inside Afghanistan are very different. Whether it is the capture, the continuing onslaught of Taliban, violence on various cities, the brutalities exacted on people, the executions that we've been seeing, really practically war crimes on a daily basis. We're not actually seeing the Taliban keep to any of its words, whether it is to call for a ceasefire, whether it was to talk towards some kind of a power sharing arrangement, whether it has been the idea that the Taliban would somehow be different from the Taliban we saw in the 1990s. So we're not filled with a lot of confidence. What we do know is that it seems as if the international players who were working on talks with the Taliban have not given up yet, despite calls from people to suspend the talks until a ceasefire is effected. We see the Doha process continuing. And then first there will be the meeting of Troika Plus, which includes US, Russia, China with Pakistan. And we heard from Pakistan this evening that their special envoy is on his way to Doha for those talks. There are expected to be some kind of intra-Afghanistan talks in Doha, or it might be just each of these players talking to the Taliban. But I do want to make the point that so far the Taliban has literally used the talks in order to give the charade that some kind of peaceful settlement is in the works, right, when in actual fact, everything the Taliban is doing on the ground belies that. Yeah. And I think what is clear is that there is some kind of command and control structure. The fact is that since the US signed its agreement with the Taliban, we have not seen attacks from the US.
Yeah.
So there is a command and control structure in place. And that command and control structure has not told the Taliban militants, the terrorists on the ground, to stop their advances.
Yeah. Mr. Mohammadi, is there a real fear of a mass exodus from various provincial capitals? Has that already started? Because 7 have fallen. Obviously, when it comes to an exodus, there are only certain people who can actually do that. A large number of people would have to remain and possibly face the worst of the Taliban. So is that something that started to happen, an exodus among people who can get out of these cities?
Unfortunately, I just experienced the major crowd of the IDPs who recently came to the Kabul, and they were settled in the Sharinau Park, the main park inside the Kabul city. So yes, and there is an escalation of the violence by the Taliban, almost 500,000 people displaced. This is the addition of already 1.2 million people IDPs, which we have already from the previous violence. So if people have some sort of affordability to leave the area, they are not going to live under the Taliban, because they daily basis they're witnessing the atrocity, the brutality of the Taliban. Because the Taliban of the today Taliban is not the Taliban of the 90s. They are more brutal, more cruel. So they become more extreme. So the people expectation and the positivity toward the Taliban now changed. Right. Now people leaving their homes and so desire to protect their life.
I can imagine. Ambassador Kaju, this is also in a sense, it necessarily means a collapse of India's Afghanistan policy, something which you helped build up through all sorts of assistance and aid and friendship, and that's all gone. So it's a huge loss for us, a resurgent Taliban, obviously the Pakistani influence in Afghanistan, terrorism in that area. Our entire policy would need to change. How do we do that?
Well, from February of 2017, I have been advocating in all my writings that India should talk to the Taliban.
And that's apparently started.
And that does not mean endorsing what the Taliban stand for or not condemning their brutality. But by 2017, it had seemed to me that the international community was accepting the Taliban, that the Americans were refusing to cross into Pakistan, because without crossing into Pakistan, they would not be able to clean up the mess or take on the Taliban effectively. After that, of course, in 2017, if you forgive me for saying, President Trump did his sort of chest-thumping act to cower down the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis looked him in the eye and said, "You won't cross the Durand, we know that." And once that happened, then it was quite clear that the international community would, while making the right noises, individually legitimize the Taliban, and that is what has happened. And today, ironically, the Americans, who have legitimized them completely through the deal, through their agreement, are now saying that we'll treat you as a pariah if you win Afghanistan by force. They well may, and Europe may, but the question is, will Russia do so? Will China do so? These are two major powers. Now, as far as Iran is concerned, I think Iran is terribly unhappy at the Taliban capturing Zaranj and Islam Killer. But the Iranians, if history bears out, keep many balls up in the air at the same time. So one can never divine what actually is Iranian policy. They go along with all kinds of things all at the same time. And I can assure you that they will maintain their links with the Taliban even if they are opposing them in some fashion.
So Hasni, just a final word to you, since I'm running out of time. For decades, America has scoffed at the then Soviet Union and their departure from Afghanistan in the late 70s, early 80s, and said that, they failed, they were never up to the task, and they were defeated by a ragtag bunch of elements within Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance. But this departure of America, saying that it's no longer fitting our interests, is the most catastrophic departure from a country which they've propped up for more than 2 decades. If anything, it's America that should be embarrassed at what is going to happen, and that is a humanitarian disaster.
Well, absolutely. And as this unfolds, I think the US is realizing that the world is looking at them and saying, how could you leave Afghanistan in this situation? I think very quickly, 3 things that the US was not able to see. One was that by controlling cities in Afghanistan, or by helping the Afghan forces control those cities, it did not mean that the Taliban had died or that the Taliban had been wiped out. The second, turning a continuous blind eye to the links of the Taliban to terrorist agencies, including Pakistan-based organizations like the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed that held camps in Helmand and other parts of the south. And the third part, I think that the US should take some of the blame for, is that promise they made in the 2000s and the 2010s that they would build a NATO-level army, military for the Afghans. They, in fact, suggested that the Afghans didn't need all Soviet equipment, that India did not need to send ammunition because they were going to move to this brand new military with all this new equipment. That promise was never made good on, and today we see the result of that the Afghan military is fighting bravely, but it still requires air power, it still requires assistance. We're not sure. Ambassador Karju spoke about the U.S. carrying out some air raids, but we're not sure how these 7 provincial capitals felt if, in fact, the U.S. was putting its complete might behind the Afghan.
It seems to be a half-hearted effort. It's clearly not America's full might. We know that. Ambassador Karju, I'm just out of time. I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it over there. I just don't have time. But I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us. It's sad that Afghanistan is in this situation, and hopefully the country can last out.